January 20th, 1981. After 444 days in captivity, 52 American hostages returned home from Iran. Crowds cheered, cameras flashed, and blasting through the speakers wasn't a hymn or the national anthem, it was Celebration by Kool and the Gang. When America needed a soundtrack for relief, it turned to funk. From the late 1960s through the mid-1980s, musicians across America created grooves so powerful they dominated radio, shaped popular music, and continue to be sampled decades later. We know the hits, but the stories behind them are even better. Tonight on RnBPulseTrack, we're counting down the 10 greatest funk grooves of the era, the groundbreaking records, the studio drama, and the overlooked musicians who changed music forever. From number 10 to number 1, these aren't just songs, they're moments that redefined what a groove could be. Let's get into it. Number 10, Celebration, Kool and the Gang, 1980.
This is your celebration.
Kool and the Gang had been in the music business since 1964. 16 years of grinding, 16 years of instrumental funk records that DJs loved and radio programmers largely ignored. They had watched trends come and go, watched competitors rise and fade, and the thing that finally broke them through to number 1 on the pop chart was not a new sound, it was a new voice.
A dedication to last throughout the year.
J.T. Taylor joined the band in 1979, and Robert Kool Bell gave him a specific instruction when it came to Celebration. He wanted something universal, something that worked at a party, a graduation, a stadium, a living room. Taylor went into the booth and delivered a vocal that became, over time, the most recognizable funk anthem in American cultural history. The song hit number 1 in January 1981 and stayed there for 2 weeks.
Together, it's up to you. What?
Here is what most people never sit with when they hear that opening horn line. The band that recorded it had been at it for 16 years before the mainstream noticed. 16 years of work, of refinement, of building a catalogue, condensed into 3 minutes and 49 seconds that the whole country decided to play when 52 hostages walked off a plane. That is not luck. That is preparation meeting a moment. Celebration has since been played at the 1981 World Series Victory Parade for the New York Yankees, at Super Bowl parties, at presidential inaugurations, and at weddings and graduations across 4 decades. Some songs define a single moment. This one defines an entire category of human experience, the feeling when the worst is over and joy is not just allowed but required. That is what Robert Kool Bell built in a recording studio in New Jersey in 1980. Number 9. Stayin' Alive, Bee Gees, 1977. Barry Gibb said the idea came from watching construction workers walk down the streets of New York City. The way they moved, the weight of their steps, the attitude of people who worked hard with their bodies and owned every inch of sidewalk they walked on. He wanted to capture that feeling in a groove, and what he and his brothers built around that image turned out to be one of the most precisely engineered pieces of pop music ever recorded. Stayin' Alive was released as part of the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack in November 1977. That album went on to sell over 40 million copies worldwide. The Bee Gees had effectively been handed the soundtrack to one of the defining cultural moments of the decade, and they delivered with a precision that still sounds modern. The song hit number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in February 1978 and held that position for 4 weeks. Here is the detail that almost nobody outside the medical community knows. The tempo of Stayin' Alive sits at approximately 103 beats per minute. That is almost exactly the recommended rate for administering CPR chest compressions. The American Heart Association officially began recommending Stayin' Alive as a tempo guide for CPR training. A disco record by 3 brothers from Brisbane, Australia became a medically endorsed life-saving tool. If that is not a legacy, the word has no meaning. The falsetto Barry Gibb developed for this era was a deliberate craft choice. It is not his natural speaking voice. He built it specifically because it could cut through a packed discotheque sound system, pierce the speakers, and reach people who were standing 70 feet from the stage. That technical decision changed what pop music was allowed to sound like, and artists are still working within the space it opened up today. Number 8. September, Earth, Wind and Fire, 1978. Ali Willis was not supposed to be in that room. She was a relatively unknown songwriter when Maurice White invited her into the all-in-all sessions at Caribou Ranch in the Colorado mountains. And when she came in with the melody and a placeholder vocal, those two syllables ba-dee-ya repeated over the groove, she told Maurice they were temporary. She would write real words later. She told him they were just holding the space. He said leave it exactly as it is. Ali Willis pushed back. Real lyrics felt more finished, more professional. Maurice White disagreed with a certainty that came from somewhere deeper than logic. He told her that ba-dee-ya meant joy. That some emotions do not need language. That the sound was doing everything the words would have done, and doing it better. Ali Willis later said that conversation changed how she thought about writing for the rest of her career. She trusted him, and she was right too. September was released in 1978 and peaked at number 8 on the Billboard Hot 100, reaching number 1 on the R&B chart. But the cultural life of this song extends decades past its original chart run. Every September 21st since 2016, when writer and actor Demi Adejuyigbe began creating viral videos celebrating the opening line, the internet collectively stops to mark a date that has no historical significance beyond Maurice White choosing it because it sounded right in a lyric. That is cultural penetration at a level most artists never reach. Not because September was the biggest selling record of 1978, because it captured something about joy that is genuinely impossible to argue with. Maurice White once said the entire philosophy of Earth, Wind and Fire was to make music that elevated people's consciousness. September is 3 minutes and 35 seconds of that philosophy working exactly the way he intended it to work. Number 7. Rock With You, Michael Jackson, 1979. Rod Temperton had never met Michael Jackson when he wrote Rock With You. He wrote it alone, by feel, imagining a voice he was writing for without knowing exactly whose it would be. He was a keyboard player from a fishing town in Lincolnshire, England, who had been writing hits for Heatwave when Quincy Jones called and asked him to fly out to Los Angeles for the off-the-wall sessions. Temperton arrived with a folder full of songs written specifically for a voice he had not yet heard in person. When Michael Jackson heard Rock With You for the first time, he is reported to have said very little. He nodded. He asked to hear it again. That was how he worked in those early sessions with Quincy, absorbing the material, letting it settle into his body before he made any decision. Then he walked into the vocal booth and delivered a performance that Rod Temperton later called one of the most natural he had ever heard from any singer in his career. The song hit number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in January 1980 and stayed there for 4 weeks. Off the Wall became the first solo album by a black artist to produce 4 top 10 singles on the pop chart simultaneously. Michael Jackson was 21 years old, and Rock With You, that shimmer, that effortless float above the groove, was the clearest early signal of what he was about to become. 3 years later, he released Thriller and rewrote the rules of the entire industry. Here is what makes this entry important beyond the chart positions. Rod Temperton also wrote the title track Thriller. A keyboard player from Lincolnshire, England, whose name most casual music fans have never heard, co-authored 2 of the most important albums in the history of popular music. That is what the music business looks like from the inside. Not always the face on the poster. Often the person nobody photographed, working alone in a room, writing a song for a voice he had never heard. Number 6. All Night Long, All Night, Lionel Richie, 1983.
Well, my friends, the time is come.
Lionel Richie spent most of the decade before his solo career writing for other people. He wrote Lady for Kenny Rogers in 1980. He co-wrote Endless Love with Diana Ross in 1981.
People dancing all in the street.
He was one of the most in-demand songwriters in the industry before he committed fully to recording under his own name. And when he finally made the record that captured everything he had been building toward, it sounded like a party that had been in planning for a decade. All Night Long was released in September 1983 from the album Can't Slow Down. Ritchie has acknowledged in interviews that the Caribbean and African-influenced lyrics in the chorus contain words he largely invented. Fiesta forever, Tombo li de say, de moi, ya, Jambo jumbo. He wanted the feeling of a global celebration, something every language could sing without needing to understand. The song hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in October 1983 and held that position for 4 consecutive weeks. The most significant live performance of All Night Long came at the closing ceremony of the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics. Ritchie performed to 90,000 people in the stadium and a global television audience numbering in the hundreds of millions.
Come on and sing along.
One of the largest live audiences for a solo performance in history up to that point. Can't Slow Down went on to win Album of the Year at the 1985 Grammy Awards. Lionel Richie was the defining commercial pop artist of that specific moment. What is easy to miss is that Ritchie was already 40 years old when All Night Long went to #1. He had spent over 20 years in the music industry, first with the Commodores, then as an in-demand songwriter, before the spotlight fully arrived. The overnight success took 2 decades to build, and when it finally came, it was built on a foundation solid enough to last. 20 years of patience made into 4 minutes of groove. We are at the halfway point of this countdown, and if you have stayed this far, you already know this is not your average music list. Every entry on RnBPulseTrack is documented history. Real people, real decisions, real consequences. And the second half of this list goes even deeper into stories that most fans never got to hear. Hit subscribe right now and turn on the notification bell, because the next 5 entries are where things get genuinely interesting. Let's keep going. Number 5, Get Down on It, Kool and the Gang, 1981. After Celebration crossed over and introduced Kool and the Gang to pop audiences, the pressure in the room for the next record was real. Robert Bell and Ronald Bell understood exactly what was at stake. They brought in Eumir Deodato, the Brazilian jazz fusion producer who had worked with them in earlier sessions, specifically because Deodato understood how to keep the pocket honest while making the production accessible enough for radio. That tension between depth and accessibility is the defining challenge of commercial funk.
Get down on it. Get down on it.
Get Down on It was released in late 1981 from the Something Special album. J.T. Taylor's vocal on this record sits in a different register than Celebration. Lower, more insistent, more conversational. Where Celebration was a peak moment anthem, Get Down on It is a mid-evening record.
Standing on the wall. Get your back up off the wall. I heard all.
It is the song that comes on 2 hours into a party, when the room has finally loosened up and everybody is moving without thinking about whether they look right doing it. The song reached number 10 on the Billboard Hot 100 and climbed to number 4 on the R&B chart. Get Down on It proved that Celebration was not a fluke.
Get your back up off the wall. Tell me.
Kool and the Gang was not a band that had stumbled into a hit. They were musicians who had spent close to 2 decades learning how to construct a groove with near engineering precision, and the records they made in the early 1980s were the result of all that accumulated craft arriving at exactly the right commercial moment. There is something specific about the horn arrangement on this record that most listeners never consciously register but physically respond to anyway. The way the brass punctuates the space between Taylor's vocal phrases. The way it leaves room to breathe. The best funk musicians understand that silence is not the absence of groove, it is part of the groove. Every gap in Get Down on It is exactly as intentional as every note that fills it. Number 4, Cold Sweat, James Brown, 1967. Before Cold Sweat, the rhythm section of a song was background. It was the canvas that the melody painted on. James Brown changed that entirely on one recording. On Cold Sweat, recorded in 1967 with a range of Pee Wee Ellis, the rhythm is the song. Everything else, the horns, the vocals, the guitar scratches, They are accents on top of a rhythmic architecture that had never existed in recorded music before. Brown told his band to get on the one, to hold the first beat and build everything from there. Cold Sweat hit number 1 on the R&B chart and reached number 7 on the pop chart. But those numbers do not capture what happened musically. This recording is the DNA of funk. The break at the 2-minute mark, where the arrangement strips down to percussion and bass, is one of the earliest examples in recorded music of what would become the breakbeat. Hip-hop built an entire architectural language from that moment. Cold Sweat is not just an influence, it is a documented origin point. Clyde Stubblefield played drums on Cold Sweat. His name is not widely known outside of music scholarship, but his performances on this and subsequent James Brown recordings became some of the most sampled drum tracks in the history of the medium. Stubblefield worked as a mechanic in Madison, Wisconsin for years, while the patterns he invented were being used to construct multi-platinum records around the world. The music industry has never fully answered for what it owes him. James Brown understood something about rhythm and the human body that most musicians were still trying to work out. He said publicly that he could feel when a groove was wrong before he could explain why. He would stop a session mid-take and tell the band the pocket was off by a fraction, and he was always right. Cold Sweat is the fullest early expression of that instinct. It is the moment he stopped chasing what music had been and started building what it was going to become. Number 3. Rhythm of the Night. DeBarge, 1985.
When it feels like the world is on your shoulder.
The DeBarge family from Grand Rapids, Michigan had 10 children. Most of them sang. And what came out of that house? That combination of strict gospel training and raw natural talent built under real pressure was something the music industry had not quite encountered before. El DeBarge had a falsetto that occupied a specific register, warm and slightly mournful even when the song demanded joy. And when he stepped to a microphone, you could hear both the gift and the weight it carried. Rhythm of the Night was written by Diana Warren, then an emerging songwriter who would eventually become one of the most commercially successful writers in music history. Produced by Richard Perry and released in 1985, the record hit number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 1 on the R&B chart.
The scene is being set, a night for romance.
What made it work was the tension between the song's deliberately bright production and El DeBarge's vocal, which always sounded like it was carrying something heavier than the melody required.
The music's playing, it's a celebration.
The DeBarge story does not end cleanly. Multiple members of the family dealt with addiction in the 1980s and 1990s. Bobby DeBarge, who had been a member of the group Switch before DeBarge formed, died in 1995 from AIDS-related complications.
Look out on the street now.
El DeBarge had his own documented struggles with substance abuse over the years. The talent that produced Rhythm of the Night existed alongside personal hardship of a kind that the industry was neither equipped nor particularly willing to address. Diana Warren has said that Rhythm of the Night was one of the early records that showed her what she was actually capable of as a songwriter. She was not yet famous in 1985. She was developing. She was building evidence. The DeBarge record was part of that evidence.
The rhythm of the night.
She went on to receive over 13 Grammy nominations and write for virtually every major artist across 3 decades of popular music. Some of the largest careers in songwriting begin exactly this way. One groove. One moment of somebody finally hearing what you can do. Number 2. Let's Groove. Earth, Wind and Fire. 1981. By 1981, Earth, Wind and Fire had already changed the rules twice. They had proven a black band could move millions of albums, not just singles. They had proven that spiritual content and commercial ambition were not opposites. And now, in the Rays sessions, Maurice White was doing something that made some longtime fans genuinely nervous. He was letting electronics into the architecture. Synthesizers, a vocoder. Sounds that felt, to a certain portion of the audience, like a departure from everything the band had been. Let's Groove opens with a vocoder, a synthesized voice that distorts and reshapes human speech into a mechanical shimmer. In 1981, putting that at the front of an Earth, Wind and Fire record was a statement, and Maurice White made it the very first thing you hear. Not the horn section, not Philip Bailey's falsetto, not a drum fill, a vocoder, and then the full band comes underneath it. And what you realize within 8 bars is that the electronics did not replace the soul. They became part of it. The song hit number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 1 on the R&B chart in late 1981. But the lasting impact of Let's Groove has less to do with its original chart performance and more to do with what it represented in the context of the catalogue. Earth, Wind and Fire was refusing to be frozen in the sound that had made them famous. They were evolving in real time, taking real risks, trusting that their audience would follow if the music was genuine. That is an uncommon decision at that level. The Rays album as a whole reflects a band standing at an inflection point with their eyes open. They knew the disco era had ended. They knew the landscape was shifting toward electronics and synthesizers. And rather than fight that shift or simply ignore it, Maurice White walked directly into it and made something that sounded like the present tense of 1981, while still containing everything that had always made Earth, Wind and Fire what they were. Let's Groove is the sound of a great band refusing to stand still. Number 1. Forget Me Nots. Patrice Rushen, 1982. Patrice Rushen performed at the Monterey Jazz Festival when she was 14 years old. 14. She was discovered there by musicians in Sonny Rollins' circle, and within a few years, she was recording as a session musician and composer in Los Angeles. She was one of the first prominent black female musician producers in the industry, at a time when that combination, black female and producer, was effectively invisible to the mainstream. Forget Me Nots was not her first record. It was the one that proved the point she had been making her whole career. Forget Me Nots was written by Patrice Rushen, bassist Freddie Washington, and Terry McFadden, and released in 1982. The bassline Freddie Washington plays on this record is one of the most elastic, economical, and perfectly locked-in bass performances in the history of funk. Patrice Rushen produced the session herself. It peaked at number 23 on the Billboard Hot 100, but hit the top 10 on the R&B chart. And then something happened to the song that those original chart numbers could never have predicted. Will Smith sampled Forget Me Nots for Getting Jiggy With It in 1997. That record hit number 1 and won the Grammy Award for Best Rap Solo Performance. Missy Elliott sampled it. Mary J. Blige drew from it. The bassline Freddie Washington laid down in 1982 has appeared in dozens of records across multiple genres across 4 decades. Their original recording has a presence in hip-hop culture that songs which charted far higher in 1982 never came close to achieving. That is a different kind of number 1. Patrice Rushen continued recording, producing, composing, teaching, and performing for decades after this song. She became the musical director for the NAACP Image Awards. She composed for television and film. She mentored younger musicians across multiple generations. The mainstream never gave her the singular spotlight her talent warranted, but the groove she built in 1982 is still running, still being found by producers flipping samples at 2 in the morning, still making people move in rooms she will never enter. That is what this countdown exists to honor. On RnBPulseTrack, the music pulse never stops.